Vladimir Putin is without a doubt the most powerful man in the world today. He is in the charge of the country which possesses not only the highest amount of natural gas in the world, but also the highest number of nuclear warheads as well. And in recent times we have all felt what real power in that sense means. Blackmailing countries which stood up against imperialism with cutting off the crucial gas supply, threatening with nuclear weapons and stating that without their vision of your country, nothing should exist at all. This kind of power left to a single man is extremely dangerous and terrifying to all reasonable people. But in the path to this power there are people who stand in your way. Politicians who are part of the opposition, independent journalists, human rights activists, ex-members of the same party, and so on. In this video, we will examine exactly that, 5 critics of Vladimir Putin that have been suspiciously murdered. Number 5. Alexander Litvinenko. Alexander Litvinenko was a former KGB and FSB operator who later defected from Russia to the United Kingdom. His position in KGB and later FSB as well was in counterintelligence with speciality of fighting in organized crime and preventing terrorism. And as a FSB agent he discovered countless connections between Russian authorities and Russian criminal groups. But when he presented his evidence to FSB director, it was ignored. In the book Death of a Dissident, which was co-written by Litvinenko's wife Marina, it was stated that in 1998, Litvinenko personally met with Putin to report corruption of FSB, but that Putin was deeply unimpressed. It's also stated that he felt disdain from Putin. However, the real clash between Litvinenko and authorities happened when Litvinenko and other 4 FSB agents reported to press that they have been ordered to kill Mikhail Terpashkin, former FSB colonel and later political prisoner, and Boris Berezovsky, Russian oligarch. After that, Litvinenko was removed from FSB and later ordered not to leave Moscow. Despite the order, Litvinenko left and eventually got political asylum in London. And there he wrote several books including Blowing Up Russia and Litvinenko Criminal Group. In the book Blowing Up Russia, Litvinenko makes the case and presents the evidence why he believes that it was Russian Secret Intelligence Agency or FSB behind the apartment bombings in Russia. The plan was to stage terrorist attacks and blame Chechens, in order to have the justification for starting the Second Chechen War. In that scenario, at that time rather unknown and unpopular Vladimir Putin would be the needed strong hand who will catch and destroy the terrorists, and of course win the election. And if you want a detailed explanation of this theory, I definitely suggest watching short documentary based on his book called The Assassination of Russia. Anyway, Litvinenko also made other allegations of FSB which include supporting terrorism, connecting and participating with organized crime groups, assassinating journalists and political enemies, and so on. However, on November 1, 2006, after meeting the 2 former KGB agents in London hotel pub, Litvinenko straight away became ill, and short period after he died. It was later discovered that he was poisoned by radioactive polonium-210. The British investigation disclosed that all evidence points toward political murder directed by Kremlin and executed by the 2 agents that Litvinenko met. The response from Russia was not surprising. They formally declined UK's request for extraction of the 2 main suspects, while the main suspect Andrei Lugovoy later became deputy of the State Duma. Number 4. Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian lawyer who investigated the case concerning financial fraud in Russia. The story began with American investor William Browder, who was the CEO and co-founder of the Hermitage Capital Management, which was at that time the largest portfolio investing company in Russia. Browder was publicly exposing corruption in state-owned companies where oligarchs would basically steal money from companies. And the response from Russian authorities was swift. Some of the oligarchs were caught and persecuted. And for some time, it seemed to Browder that Putin was fighting corruption and that he wanted to create healthier business environments. But later found out, the harder way, that it was not the case. So in 2005, Browder was suddenly denied entry to Russia and was declared as threat to national security. At that point he realized that Putin wasn't fighting corruption, but rather eliminating his opponents and removing oligarchs who were not loyal to him. Later his offices were raided by police, in which companies' documents were seized. So in order to find the legal help, and the reason why his offices were raided and documents stolen, he assigned Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. Magnitsky discovered that they have used companies' documents to re-register Hermitage Holdings companies to the ex-convict. In that way, they faked documents and applied for $230 million in tax refunds, which eventually they received. Or in other words, they stole that money from Russian taxpayers. However, Magnitsky persisted to seek justice and report this crime to the top. And then he was arrested in 2008. They put him in notorious prison where he was beaten, tortured, treated in inhumane ways, and denied medical help which he urgently needed. Prison personnel issued of him signing the confession, where he would admit false accusations of Hermitage Fund and lie about Russian officials. However, he didn't break and was beaten to death in prison, just 7 days before the expiration of 1-year time limit where suspects can be imprisoned without a trial. No one was convicted for his murder. Number 3. Anna Politkovskaya. Anna Politkovskaya was a Russian journalist and human rights activist who became famous for writing about political events and situation in Russia, and especially about the situation in Chechnya during the Second Chechen War. As a journalist on the ground, there she reported on massive violations of human rights committed against civilians by Russian forces and pro-Russian regime. She accused state allies Kadyrov's of creating regime based on abduction, torture and murder. And because of her work, she herself has been subject to such, which includes beatings, threats, detentions, poisoning and mock execution. In her book Putin's Russia, Politkovskaya writes about various problems and atrocities which are happening under the regime of Vladimir Putin. She accuses Putin of creating a police state, enhancing terrorism instead of fighting it, creating deep web of corruption in every part of the system, and eliminating any independent media. And as independent journalist, Politkovskaya expressed genuine fear for her life because of her work. And confirmation that her fear was indeed unfortunately justified occurred on Putin's birthday on 7th of October 2006. In the center of Moscow, Politkovskaya was shot several times inside the elevator of her building. Later, 5 men were sentenced to prison for her murder, but the contractor was not identified. Number 2. Boris Berezovsky. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a tiny percentage of Russians got extremely wealthy in privatization process. They are known as Russian oligarchs. And probably the most influential oligarch in the era of presidency of Boris Yeltsin was Boris Berezovsky. Starting his career as engineer and academic, Berezovsky eventually became wealthy from having an arbitrage business in automobile industry, and later, from taking control over the state-owned assets. However, his huge influence on Russian politics and President Boris Yeltsin came from his financing Yeltsin's presidential campaign in 1996. And after Yeltsin was re-elected, Berezovsky became his main advisor, so his influence became enormous as well. However, when the President Yeltsin decided to retire in 1999, Berezovsky welcomed and supported Yeltsin's next successor, Vladimir Putin. And short period after Putin became the next Russian president, Berezovsky left the government and became his most vocal critic. According to Berezovsky, the reason why there was a conflict between him and Putin was because Putin was leading country back to authoritarianism and its ruin. Nevertheless, the other reason could be that Berezovsky simply didn't have any influence on Putin. So he tried to remove him. It was a situation where the king turned against the kingmaker. And Putin really went against him with a few fraud charges, which forced Berezovsky into the exile. In 2003, Berezovsky was granted political asylum in Britain, from where he tried to fight Putin with other dissidents. On the other side, in Russia, Putin was constantly adding more charges to Berezovsky and requested his extradition from UK. Eventually, Berezovsky became enemy of the state #1 and ultimate scapegoat for all political crimes. Also, there were some allegations of assassination attempts on Berezovsky linked to Kremlin, according to Litvinenko and other intelligence agents. Anyway, for some time, Berezovsky was plotting to overthrow Putin and return to Russia. But eventually it was all in vain. Left with only a portion of his wealth, he was considered as a broken man. The one who had it all, and lost it all to one man. And on the 23 March 2013, he was found dead in his mansion near London. The cause of death was unidentified, and it remains an open verdict. Number 1. Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov was without a doubt the key figure of Russian opposition. Before entering politics, he earned his PhD degree in physics and mathematics, and for some time, worked at Radiophysical Research Institute in Nizhny Novgorod. However, in 1989, he decided to enter the politics with some unusual views for Soviet citizen. He advocated liberal democracy, freedom of speech and private ownership, which was mildly set radical at that time. Later, he successfully served as a governor of Nizhny Novgorod, with implementing numerous free market policies, which resulted in his popular re-election. And Yeltsin, who put him in that position, was deeply impressed by his work. In 1997, there was a high probability that he will become his second Russian president. Boris Yeltsin unofficially declared him as his next successor. And if everything continued in that direction, we would today undoubtedly witness a radically different Russia. But Yeltsin finally decided to appoint Vladimir Putin as his next successor. The reason why Yeltsin made that decision was not that clear. But two possible reasons would be: first, Nemtsov's popularity significantly decreased after the Russian stock market crash, so his winning probabilities were not that high. And the second one is that Yeltsin needed someone who could guarantee him that he will not persecute him for the crimes he has committed before. And ex-KGB Colonel Vladimir Putin was a far better choice in that sense. After Yeltsin resigned and Putin became active president, he made a famous New Year speech, where he declared that he will lead Russia into democratic course and promised protection of civil rights, freedom of speech and press, private ownership, and so on. So in 2000, he won the election and became second Russian president. But despite said promises, in reality Putin started to lead country in exact opposite direction. And soon period after, Nemtsov became one of his most vocal and fiercest critics. Nemtsov wrote many articles and repeatedly warned about Putin's way towards dictatorship, state corruption, and gradual decline of freedom in Russia. He was also several times arrested for participating in organizing many anti-Putin protests across the Russia, and eventually became the main figure of Russian opposition as Putin's grip on Russia became stronger and stronger. In 2008, Nemtsov and famous chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov created United Political Movement with the aim of uniting political opposition of Putin in Russia. The idea was to unite all people of different ideologies and worldviews who are against Vladimir Putin into the single political party. However, due to the government sabotages and internal conflicts, it didn't work out as planned. Later, Nemtsov was very critical of organized Winter Olympics in Sochi, which ended up as the most expensive Olympics in history. He talked about the lack of sense in organizing Winter Olympic Games in subtropical part of Russia, and enormous government corruption, which costed Russians around $25 billion. Nemtsov also supported Ukraine integration into European Union, and criticized Russian annexation of Crimea, and as well arming of pro-Russian rebels in Donbass, which Putin denied. He advocated peace, and declared Russo-Ukrainian war as Putin's war on Ukraine, rather than Russian. We can say that Nemtsov was a spokesman of Russian opposition to the West, and they recognized him as a fearless and restless fighter for democracy in Russia. Even though he repeated many times that he is not afraid of Putin, some of his close friends, including his mother, warned him that his life might be in danger. And unfortunately they were right. On February 27, 2015, he was assassinated on the bridge very close to the Kremlin. He was shot several times from an unidentified car and died instantly. The public reaction was outrageous. Thousands of Russians protested, and they blamed Russian government for his assassination. Vladimir Putin labeled Nemtsov murder as a shameful act, and announced state investigation, but almost everyone among the Russian opposition was convinced that he was in fact behind the murder. Anyway, official state investigation convicted 5 Chechens as guilty for murdering Nemtsov in exchange for 15 million rubles. However, the identity of headhunter's contractor was not revealed, and the case was closed. But recently, the new evidence emerged, where a couple of investigative journalist groups found that Nemtsov was followed by FSB assassination squad. The same agents were linked to poisonings of Alexei Navalny and Vladimir Kara-Murza. This evidence further enhances the assurance that murder of Nemtsov was in fact job of Russian government, as many people believe. And the response from Kremlin for all of these cases was something like this: "We are not that stupid to do that. It would be so obvious. And the damage from their deaths is greater than the damage of their entire work. Why would we do something which brings us more harm than good?" But if you think about it, it is an efficient way for removing your opponents, isn't it? There are obviously many more victims of this regime, but we have picked these 5, since each of them can represent different category. Alexander Litvinenko was an intelligence agent. Sergei Magnitsky was a regular lawyer who was a victim of state corruption. Anna Politkovskaya was an independent journalist. Boris Berezovsky was a kingpin and rebel oligarch. And Boris Nemtsov was an opposition politician. And that would be all for this video. If you want more, please like and subscribe.